I went like this, and it's like this was moving without the table. There we go.
1, 2, 3.
Who's going to play the drums?
Frank said he was going to. Frank said
Are you playing the drums?
While you read?
Okay.
You will.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to Mecca. I'm very excited and happy to see you all here. Yay! Thank you for all the new faces. I see lots of new faces and some people who are tried and true, who are here all the time. Mecca's been open since March, so not very long. We are in our second, well, technically our third iteration of the gallery, meaning that we rotate artists through, featured artists and all of that, once a month. And right now we have featured artist is Jonathan Naylor. He is the large, beautiful, emotional pieces. And then we have, of course, our very own Joan Pahanek, who had a birthday recently. Happy birthday. We love you, Joan. And she, of course, is beautiful color, amazing color and texture, and full of rich emotion and sight. And I just want to let you guys know also that we have some amazing authors here, and this is actually our second iteration of an evening with Oregon writers, and I think we're going to make it a regular. I'm very excited about that. We actually just picked up a romance novelist, and we're going to be putting on an event.
Boy, was she heavy.
You're funny, aren't you? We're actually going to be doing an event in August. Our next, in August, we'll be doing one related to romance, because it's Romance Month next month. Who knew? I'm really excited about that. I love romance. You would think it would be February, right? Anyway, so my husband is here from the kitchen. Poor guy, he gets slaving away.
Could I say something?
Yes, of course. Hold on, go for it.
So we have these three great guys, all writers, poets, in their own right. I'm wearing my flower power shirt. I'm sure these three could tell us more about the 60s than any of us even know.
I wasn't there, were you, Frank?
But in honor of that, our spread tonight is all 60s cocktails. It's the little wieners and the clam and the idea and the shrimp cocktail. So have some food with your wine. We don't want you driving drunk. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Sounds good.
Yeah, so I'm going to just be quiet and turn it over to Stephen, who helped to put this together. He pulled the artists together, the writers together, writers.
I was going to say, the other guys couldn't make it tonight, so it's me. No, come on, guys. What we thought we'd do, we were talking about sort of a panel discussion and just various things. Charlie came up with this, and I think it's a good one. Is just to sequentially tell you how we came to this place, and then read a little, and then the next person would do the same thing. And then we'll do a Q&A. If you have any Q's, we'll have the A's. They may not be accurate, but we'll give it to you. So anyway, I'm Steve Long. Charlie Price.
Frank Lisciandro.
And so I'll tell you about my writing journey. When I was, in high school and more so in college, I would write poetry, and I think kids that age do. And I thought it was okay, and I liked it. And then it came time to graduate, and I went to Cal Poly. And at that time, you had to do a senior project. And there was nothing that interested me. My major was English for some reason. There was nothing interested me except writing. And I thought, I proposed this to my advisor. And he was really reluctant. He really didn't, he wanted me to do something else, but he didn't make any suggestions, and I didn't know what to do. So eventually he conceded, and I wrote something. and it was about 100-page dystopian science fiction futuristic thing. And I thought it was an interesting concept. And the concept was that in the future, civilization will have sort of almost snuffed itself out with the garbage that we create. Resonates, see? And, but the crux of this was the protagonist was a youngish person, and they would spend their days, they were all taken care of because the people in charge didn't want a recurrence of this runaway production and civilization. So a small group of people provided all the food and shelter and so on, and then the population was just kind of left to roam. And this young guy did, and he came across, he was digging down in piles of refuse and came across a toolbox and realized that the tools have power. And so he made a shrine, and he didn't know what they were, didn't know how to make them work, but he made a kind of a shrine to the tools, and that was the story. So I think the concept was good. It turns out that the writing was awful. and I'm not kidding, it was embarrassingly bad. So now I graduated when I was 24, and I thought, well, I wasn't blessed with the talent. I thought you just wrote. I thought you sat down and wrote something and it was terrific. And so I tried and it was crummy, and I thought, well, I can't do that. So then we got married and we had kids, and I lived my life and everything. And at some point, in fact, I was 40, I think, and I had just a revelation, and that was, if singers can take singing lessons and actors can take acting classes, maybe I could go to school and learn something. So I signed up for a creative writing class, and I went to class, and I looked around, and everybody was younger than me. And I thought, well, this is dumb. What am I doing here? Except we got our first assignment, and I did it, and I'll tell you something, not to be overly dramatic, but I thought, this is me. This is what it feels like. I could do things, I was good enough to make the team, and I was good enough to get a job, but I always felt like when I got up in the morning, I said to myself, if you were going to be on a basketball team, this is how you would act. If you were going to have a business, this is how a businessman acts. And so I felt like I was acting. But when I wrote, I thought, no, I'm not acting. So it felt like me. Anyway, so this is my second novel. Holly is my first one. And I was just so taken by a couple of things. The novel Lonesome Dove, I thought the character development in that was just terrific. And it was a sprawling novel that you could get lost in. And then I also, about that time, the song, Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys. And that, the two of those together sort of resonated, and I thought, this is about Western or cowboys, but really isn't it about all of us? Don't we all love contradictory things? And so then I started to, and in fact, the protagonist here was introduced in the first book, and I thought, well, he's the guy because that's his character. But I also had been for years and years and years collecting little sayings, and I wanted somebody's mouth to put those in, and he seemed like the guy. In fact, I heard one actually not so long ago, and I thought, I gotta get that in the book somehow. And the book was pretty much written and done, but I went back and I stuck it in. And it is, a guy was I work at the Habitat Restore, and a guy looked at something and he said, that is strange as suspenders on a snake. And I thought, well, that's going in here.
Yeah.
So these are not too painfully long. Early on here, Owen, who is the protagonist, meets a lady and just really falls for her, and he's wooing her, and they met under not great circumstances. He was dead drunk in a bar, and this woman came in with her friend to celebrate a birthday. So he was impolite, and he's trying to make up for it. And he did talk her into a date or coerced her, and so this is number 2. Owen thought his dinner with Iris had gone pretty well. They chatted amiably the rest of the evening, and Iris even lingered at her car when they said goodnight. In fact, he felt so confident on his drive home, he expected the evening to be just the first of many such dates. So it surprised him when he phoned her at work a few days later, and she declined a second rendezvous. I thought we were getting along fine, he said. Are you still upset about that day at Drake's? I pretty much only drink like that when I'm bored. You could keep me occupied and sober. He heard her sigh. It isn't that, she said. I had fun the other night. I was so thrilled to find someone from home, I didn't realize how lonely I've been. But I came to California for a reason. Now I have school and homework, and after that, my time at the hospital. I need to get through my studies. I don't have time for a relationship. With the phone to his ear, Owen glanced around his little apartment. He rented it furnished, and the only things truly his own were an easel and some paint set up near the window. It struck him that maybe he was the one who should be lonely. He'd never had any real friends, just fellows doing the same thing at the same time, playing football, driving, drinking. Even so, he couldn't remember ever feeling lonely, if lonely meant wanting to be with someone. At least he had until now. Well, he said, I don't believe all that work is healthy for you. You have to take a break every so often to clear your head. I'll tell you what, I'm going to phone you once in a while. I figure that can't hurt, talking 10 minutes a couple times a week. And if you don't want to talk, you can just hang up on me. You'll be in complete control of the situation. How does that sound? I don't know, she said slowly, then added, it won't work. What do you mean it won't work? How can it not work? You pick up the phone and talk, or you put it back down. It won't work because I know you. There was a new lightness in her voice that encouraged Owen. Now, wait a minute, he said, getting into the spirit. You think you know me because we had dinner? Why, there's all sorts of surprises left. I could be a grab bag of fun, and you'd miss all that turning me down. What is it you think you know that's so awful? This time when Iris spoke, her voice had lost the playfulness he remembered from their evening together. I didn't say it was awful, but I will say persistent. Did you ever hear the story of the camel that got his nose under the tent? Owen said he hadn't heard that one, but thought Iris might relate it in detail over a pitcher of margaritas. She hung up then, not saying goodbye, but just exactly. Owen was out of the area 3 days straight after his conversation with Iris. The deliveries took him north on 99, up through Bakersfield and Delano, then to Laurie and Visalia, and into Stockton. It was a milk run, dropping off warehouse items mostly, pallet loads of cooking oil and peanut butter, though there was one stop in the oil field at McKittrick and another at a farmhouse in Porterville. He and the farmer worked an hour dragging a harrow to the back of the trailer, where they boomed it to a loader and lifted it out. At the farthest point north, when the trailer was empty, Owen swung east to Carson City. He picked up a trailer load of axles and tires, stripped from mobile homes and destined for return to the manufacturer in Riverside. The 2 nights he was on the road, he phoned Iris from his motel. On the 3rd night, back home again, he called from his apartment. I thought you said you'd only call a couple of times a week. 3 can be a couple, Owen answered. It only seems like more because they happen to be in a row. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Owen didn't pursue that line. He took a different tack. Do you like macaroons? Where's this going? She said, suspicious. I like macaroons. Trouble is, if I have one, I want another. One macaroon just doesn't do it for me. If there was only one left in the pack, I'd eat it. Then all I could think about was more. It would drive me crazy. Know what I mean? Iris said she thought she did know. So I'm a macaroon now? Suddenly Owen was at a loss. He was about to say he didn't know if she was a macaroon or not because he hadn't yet had her. But that line surely would be misinterpreted, or rather interpreted correctly, leading to disastrous end. Let's try something else, he said finally. Say I'm the throttle and you're the brake. Even if I want to go ahead, you can slow us down. Owen, Iris said softly, that's exactly the reason this won't work. Gracious, he said, what am I missing now? I like macaroons too. You can just imagine where that's going.
Straight to her.
What's that?
Yeah.
I said, damn, now I want to read it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I like macaroons too.
Yeah. So this, the novel really takes place in about 2 weeks, or covers a 2-week span. And it's the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And not to give too much away, but Owen has been bad. Thank you. I'm succinct. And so he's gone from his Southern California home to his boyhood home in South Dakota. There he met his brother's new wife. There's a reason he lost the old one. And he also met his niece and nephew. Along the way, he talked his new sister-in-law into letting him take his nephew hunting. And there's a trade-off there. He has to do something for the nephew, but he gets to take the boy hunting. So they've been out, they scouted around, they took a break for lunch. And that's where this starts. By midday, they were back at the truck eating lunch from the cooler. Jack balanced himself on the frame, his back against the cab, legs stretched out in front of him and crossed to be as narrow as possible. Owen sat sideways on the cab's floor with the passenger door open. He had shot another bird on the way back, a grouse, after waiting interminably for Jack to fire. Owen had his elbows on his knees. Hunched over, he held a sandwich in both hands. 3 won't do it, he said around a mouthful of bread. They aren't that big. Figure 6 people, 7 if Roscoe changes his mind for some reason and eats with us. Jack shook his head. D won't have any. Plus there's other stuff to eat, potatoes and stuff, and dessert. Mom always makes a ham too. Up to you, Owen said, stretching his back. We can go back out and try again or head home, either way. He waited for Jack to decide their course, but when the voice spoke, it was to change the subject. When Dad was my age, did you guys go out hunting together? As if he didn't already know the answer, Owen looked skyward. You're 12, right? When Ernie was 12, I was 17. I mostly hunted on my own by then. Jack had asked the wrong question, or asked it in the wrong way. He seemed uninterested in Owen's behavior. I mean, did Dad ever hunt? He never said anything about it. He doesn't even own a gun. The day had warmed, so that with all the walking, Owen had become overheated. He'd taken off his jacket when they got to the truck, but now, sitting, he was chilled again. He stood and stretched, then slipped on the jacket once more. I guess he tramped after me once in a while. He was too little to shoot back then, and I couldn't say if he took it up after I left. It wasn't strictly true about Ernie being too young to hunt. Evidence to the contrary was sitting on the truck frame. Jack was the same age and he was hunting, and Owen had been handling a weapon of one kind or another since he could walk. He'd made rubber band guns, killed crows with a wrist rocket, begged for a Daisy Spitton image, gone plinking with a Crossman. By the time Owen was 7, he regularly sneaked a .22 from the house and harried all manner of wildlife. The fact that Ernie showed no interest in any of it, even at 7 or 8 or 9, always struck Owen as curious. He viewed the fact as one more deficit his brother suffered. I know he was married before, Jack said. This was a curious segue, but understandable. Owen was a newfound source of information about Jack's father. His mother hadn't known Ernie back then, and neither his grandmother nor Roscoe would be especially forthcoming about the past. And Owen couldn't imagine Ernie mentioning any part of that period for fear the rest would come to light. So it made sense that only Owen seemed capable of filling in that particular history for the boy. He came over and sat on the tire beside his nephew. Jack asked, "Did you know the lady?" Owen shrugged. "I met her." "What was she like?" Owen gave consideration to what Trilby Dark was like, and decided nitroglycerin was not a bad comparison, for she was at once deadly and life-saving. He recalled her lyrical voice, the smell of her skin, her sassy walk. Trilby represented, with one notable exception, a carefree and altogether transcendent experience. That was a long time ago, partner. I can't say I remember a great deal. But what did she look like, Jack pressed? How did she act? Why would Dad marry her if they weren't going to stay together? You must remember something. Owen glanced at Jack. I mean, he did leave her, right? Why would he do that? Was she like ugly or mean or something? What would Jack do if he knew the circumstances, Owen wondered? Pick up the gun, shoot him, break into sobs? Could a young boy even understand such things? Owen wasn't sure he understood it himself. He had never been drawn to anything like he'd been drawn to Trilby Dark. Not to marijuana or alcohol, not to the power of an 18-wheeler, or even to his art on the rare occasion he painted a scene he actually liked. Although Owen held himself undeniably guilty regarding their involvement, he doubted he could have resisted the young woman any more than he could have resisted drawing breath. I truly do not recall, Owen said, but whatever the reason for him leaving, I'd say it's a lucky thing he did. Otherwise, you and your sister would still be gathering moonbeams, and I'd be out here hunting all by myself again. Owen slapped his knees. The action appeared to cause him to stand. So what's it going to be, Hot Rod? We going to try it again, or piss on the fire and call it a day? Jack grinned. We don't have a fire. Owen held out his arms and looked around as if he dropped his keys in the dirt. By golly, you're right. How did that happen? 12 is a nice age for a boy. He can make exploratory trips into the neighboring adulthood, then retreat to the safer territory from which he came. For the moment, Jack chose the familiar ground of being a child. I guess you forgot to make one. I guess I did. So we better go hunting. I believe you're right. Thank you. Charlie.
I'm going to stand.
These seats are terribly uncomfortable. I'm going to stand too.
Thank you, Frank.
You pushy ones, huh?
Hello, thank you for coming. And Mecca, thank you. What a treat to have a venue to talk about writing. My name is Charlie Price. And when I was a boy, my father was a college administrator by day and a nasty alcoholic by night. And weighed against that, there was a miracle once a week. I went to a one-room school, and on Tuesday mornings, an ugly white van would arrive in the dirt yard that we had out front of the school, and it was the bookmobile. And that lit our fire completely. All of us kids rushed out, and we got to pick 2 books, which seemed, even though I didn't read very quickly at that time, 2 books seemed like such a limit, such an unfair limit. And when I got home at night, rather than listen to my folks argue in the living room, I'd go to my bedroom. And night after night, I was with John Paul Jones fighting British sailors. I was with Sam Houston defending the Alamo and losing. I was away in a marvelous magic carpet realm that thrilled me in ways I could not articulate. I didn't believe it was possible to be a writer, because in my mind, that kind of thrill, that kind of juice came from people like who were presidents or senators or movie stars or rock stars. Writing was out of the question. And I never seriously entertained it. But through my life, I found ways, times, to write a little bit. And a woman who I admired enormously because of her politics for the poor had an idea to have an anthology in Redding, California, where I lived. And I wanted to honor her by applying for it, by contributing if I was chosen, but I wanted to be one of the people who applied. And a story of mine was selected, and afterwards the people who were selected got together in the bookstore, and at the end of the night, 6 of us were left. And we sat in a coffee bar that was attached to the bookstore, and someone said, let's have a writing group. And I thought, that is the worst idea. I can't stand to, I don't even know you people. I have no idea what you'd think of my writing. I was totally against it. But it was 5 to 1. Everybody else thought it was a really good idea. And I kind of rolled, went like a reed with the flow. And it turns out that in spite of my thinking, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because after that, for several years, I wrote at least a story a week and began to wish to be published. And along when I was about 60, I got into an argument with the owner of the school where I was the academic dean, and he fired me. I thought I was resigning, but actually he turned the table on me. But that was another unexpected gift, because you know what happens when you get fired? You get a poor man's Guggenheim. For 6 months, you get unemployment. Oh boy. So I talked with Joni. I said, you know, I don't know what to do, because I don't want to go back to a school right now, and I'm tired of working on locked psychiatric units. And she said, well, now here's a chance to write a book. And that terrified me, as you can well imagine. You can't say that to anyone and not have that person well up with fear, because it's clearly impossible to write a book. I mean, I still believe that. They're too long, it's too much work, it's too many ideas. But I had an author friend that I used to do a school with, and he and Joni got together and said, you should give this a shot. You have free money for a while. So I wrote, like many of us do, I wrote an autobiographical book about growing up in the Dust Bowl in Colorado in the 50s. And while I was shopping that book around, because the only thing I wanted to do was be published. I didn't want to hand it out without that. I wanted some kind of validation from someone who didn't know me. That was really important to me. Some kind of objective. So while I was shopping that around, I was getting letters back saying, Mr. Price, thank you very much. This is a most interesting manuscript, and we wish you the best of luck with it. While I was doing that, I was living on a river up in Dunsmuir, and a girl in our hometown was kidnapped, a girl my daughter's age, and I was awake at night often thinking about her and her family and how they coped with it, because I wasn't sure I could cope with it if it were my daughter. Wasn't sure how I could manage that. And I decided one day sitting by the river that I would write a book that found that girl. And I realized as I thought about it for about a week, I had characters from that area in my stories that I've been writing for years. Robert Barry Compton, a mentally ill man who lived just barely off the streets, and a detective that I had met in my work on the locked unit in the county. So I began writing on this novel, and when I shopped that one around, I had some interest. I had a couple of agents and an editor, and the editor, I really liked how the editor understood that book. I really liked how she wanted to represent it, and so I went with her, and that started at 61, a writing career. And I was really, really lucky to have that happen. And by the same token, it showed me that all of us in this room could start a writing career at just about any point you want. There is so many marvelous writers that are not published. There are hundreds of thousands of marvelous writers that aren't published. And there are some that are, that I wouldn't publish. So I think there's hope for all of us. But anyway, I saw it as hope for me, and that book did well, and so these books started. And what I wanted, because I think writing a book is such work, and luckily you get to do it alone. And if anyone walks near you, your imaginary space collapses a little bit, so you have to kind of protect that time. I began writing about stories that stuck in my craw that I learned in schools and psych hospitals. I worked with 3 girls who were hurt by their brothers, and each of them turned out differently. I wanted to write about one of those girls. I worked I learned about a family that was so sick at home that they infected an entire community. And I wanted to write that story. And the more I thought about that story, I wanted to combine it with the racism against Indians. In Montana, some people speak about Native Americans exactly the way they speak about people of color in the South. Exactly the same words. Drink shoe polish, lazy, shiftless. When I moved up to Montana, I was stunned that this beautiful state could have, some people have those attitudes. It made me sick. So I wanted to present that. And I wanted to tell kind of a love story, and I wanted to have sports. I had all these ideas, and I presented to this editor that I told you that I really liked, and she said, that's 6 books, we can't do it. And so I wrote other books for a little bit, but I kept that one close. And that book, I'll start with today, it's called The Interrogation of Gabriel James. That book wound up winning an Edgar Mystery Award for Young Adult Mystery Award for the United States. And I was totally blown away, speechless and blubbering, embarrassing myself, but luckily my editor stood up and walked me. That's another story. Anyway, that book had, when I got a chance to give my first talk, it had 11 separate books telling that story, from the sick kid's point of view, from the coach's point of view, from the woman in the social worker in the help center's point of view, and none of them were right until one day I thought about, what if it was an interrogation? What if 2 deputies asked the questions that I would ask, and the kid has to answer, but he can't tell too much because he's not sure how culpable he is in this story. So he has to tell part of the truth, but they keep asking. And for the author, for the writer, you have to tell a story that comes in bits and pieces, and at the end is a whole. So it's a little like a card trick that's peeled a layer of it like a striptease card trick. You know. So this is the start of that book. I stood at the back of a small crowd in a bleak cemetery north of the Yellowstone River, the second funeral I had attended this week. A pastor waited at the head of the grave for someone to offer any last remarks. No one did. The deceased father stood closest to the coffin, hands cuffed in front of him, long gray hair moving when wind gusted. A deputy sheriff stood beside him, and farther back, the cuffed man's daughter stood with my mother, both of them in solemn black dresses that didn't look like they would ever be worn for anything but a funeral. There was no music. If there had been any eulogy, I'd missed it. Though last week's warm Chinook had cleared snow from the surrounding hills, the ground underfoot was cold and solid, the dust bound by ice. In the distance, clouds drifted southwest toward Hardin and Crow Agency. Other than blasts of wind and people's shoes creaking, it was quiet. Too far from the interstate to hear traffic, too near the dead of winter for bird songs. The pastor, a liberal theology teacher from a local college, cleared his throat. Well, he said, I guess that's all. It sounded like an apology. Everyone began walking back toward the cars except the father and the deputy. I stopped to watch, wondering whether the man would throw dirt on the coffin. The deputy took a step back, but the father didn't move. He was looking straight out past the grave, out toward the Pryor Mountains, where a falcon circled above empty rangeland. Yesterday I'd been standing in a different cemetery, out the direction he was looking, where they buried another young man. That young man had killed the person being buried today. I knew there was a lot more to the story than that. I knew enough to wish that time would collapse like an old telescope, that some events, once seen in greater detail, would disappear from the horizon, gone for good, gone forever. We may talk some about writing later on, but one of the things I love about writing is that I take people that I care about that either frighten me or that I respect or that I'm confused by, and I put them in a situation that I don't know how to handle. And I'm interested to see how they'll handle it. And I think part of that comes from working on locked units, because time and again I was flat out amazed by the courage and resilience of the people that wound up on locked units. Horribly embarrassing, often their life in shreds. And for the kids, if they took something home, things blew up, like your nitroglycerin. So they were on their own. Their coming of age was theirs alone. And they were lucky if they had enough social skills to attract a friend, but many didn't. So I was constantly astounded by their courage. And when I started to write, I knew that somehow I wanted to represent those people that I'd been meeting that inspired me and inspire me to this day. Sometimes I told a story that stuck in my craw. But one time, Joni and I are driving in a convertible out by the Salton Sea, and we're driving through barren country where if you see a sagebrush, it's like an oasis. And we looked over and there was a trailer backed up against Joshua Tree National Scree Ridge. It's all rough and nothing but dirt, and a rusty trailer's backed in there with a pickup in front of it. And Joni said, I wonder what those people are doing. And in that moment, it unspooled before me. I saw what was going on in that trailer. I saw who was living in it, and I saw what I felt was going to happen. And this story began to emerge, which I started to write down when we got back to our room. The fight started after midnight. Scotty drunk, Angel's mother shrill on Crystal. When it didn't die down, Angel left the trailer to sleep nearby in a small draw where one of the drainage creases made a cradle. Screened from night winds, cut off from the yelling and threats, Angel could nestle in her robe and watch the stars. She no longer made wishes. 14 was too old for wishes. Sleeping outside was just one more thing that had to be done. And when she awakened at dawn, the truck was gone, and the trailer was empty. The inside wall by the door was bloody. Later, Angel wished she'd changed clothes, shed her robe and put on jeans and a jacket. Wished she'd grabbed her day pack and taken the bread and a couple of water bottles. But no. She had to find her mother. Couldn't think of anything else. The pickup tracks went north, away from the westbound dirt ruts that connected their squatter camp to Dillon Road. Maybe she'd noticed that before she went into the trailer. Maybe that caused the rush. Angel knew there was nothing to the north except cactus and yucca and tall, scree ridges that bordered the California desert. She had walked 20 minutes or more when she stopped to slip off a shoe and shake out an annoying piece of gravel. And in that quiet moment, she heard the drone of Scotty's truck bucking terrain and compound low, and found his line of dust on the horizon. She stepped out of her sweatpants, used them to erase her footprints as she scrabbled several yards from the track to flatten behind a creosote bush. She waited until he passed before looking out. Seemed like he was alone in the cab. She didn't pay any attention to the brief flood of sadness. Sorrow can make its own desert, and Angel's tears dried a long time ago. When the truck was out of sight, she stood, shook her pants off, and put them on and resumed walking, following his pickup tracks, and finally the drag marks. Angel found her mother's shallow grave before noon. So this story goes on to look at the hunt for Angel. This man returns to the trailer and sees that Angel knows. And one of the things I wanted to say to you about writing was that Angel finally leaves the trailer and is walking up a dirt road. She's forgotten water, she's dry and thirsty. But I know what's going to happen because I mentioned Dillon Road. I know that this paved road is right out there. And I know more that she's going to cross that road. She's going to go up in the hills that separate that town from San Diego, and she's going to meet an Afghan vet, a hard, wizened, wiry little guy, angry at everybody, who sees Angel for the companion, the compatriot, the kindred spirit that she is, and he's going to help her take on Scotty. And when Angel got to the road, she turned right. She did not cross the road. Did not cross the road. Did not go up into the mountains where I was waiting to meet the Afghan vet. I couldn't believe it. Whose book is this? Joni heard me screaming. She thought that I had dropped coffee in my mouth, my computer. But I was screaming at this turn of events, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I called a couple of my close writer friends. They said, well, you know, it's your book. So I had to decide, and I decided to go with it. And in going with it, she walked up over a rise, and on the other side of the rise is a hard scrabble farm, peopled by a family illegally here from Mexico. And the Salton Sea, as many as you know, is very, very close to the Mexican border. In fact, I have a lot of not a lot, but I have some untranslated Spanish in this book. And I found a girl in Paso Robles, that's how they say it down there, in Paso Robles, who worked with the illegal immigrants in a church. And so she took the book Spanish to them, and they vetted it as being accurate. Anyway, so I tell you that because this writing is a mysterious experience. And it's like any of you, when you have a creative moment, all of your experience has led up to that. All of your education, all the people you've known, the movies you've seen, have led up to that moment, but you had never had that thought before. Never imagined that invention before. Never saw the way to build this particular project before. And in that moment of invention, there is a wild openness to our interior inspiration that we can either honor or we can close off. And I'm here to tell you, if you want to honor it, it will respond to that invitation. Thanks. That's cheating.
Cheating.
So I think I'm here under false pretenses because I'm really not a writer. I've written things and I published books. This one is self-published. But I'm a documentarian. I'm a photographer and a filmmaker. And that's my university training and what I've been doing all my life. The first book I wrote was because I asked a friend of mine who was an agent in New York, photography agent, well, what am I going to do to all these 60s photographs I made? All these bands I took pictures of. He said, well, I'll see if I can get a book deal. I said, yeah, as long as I don't have to write any. Well, she found a publisher, and the publisher said, well, we want some text. Okay. I thought, well, this is a good opportunity for me to talk about my experiences in the 60s, and I'll just revolve these stories around a guy I knew by the name of Jim Morrison. No one wants to read about me, but a lot of people probably want to read about Jim Morrison. So I wrote about my experiences hanging out, making films, going to film festivals, and doing numerous things with Jim. And that seemed like a good way to publish a book and my photographs. This book also has Jim Morrison on the cover. And it's an oral history. So I really didn't write it. The people who I interviewed or had conversations with really wrote the book. I transcribed each of these conversations word for word. Bad grammar, yes. Their own phraseology, yes. And I put a few of my pictures in the book too. Pictures of the people who I went to interview, because they were friends of mine as well as being friends of Jim's. And so they put themselves in this book, because an oral history essentially talks about a subject, but it talks about a lot of other subjects. So this book is about Jim Morrison, but it's also about music in the 60s. It's about the 60s. It's about Los Angeles in the 60s. It's about whatever they wanted to tell me that had to do with the main character. I'm honored to be with two writers, and I've learned a lot tonight listening to them talk about writing. A lot of their experiences in writing happened to me as a photographer. That is that moment of clarity where you see something or you need to take a picture of something, to document something. You can't explain why or how, but with enough experience and some knowledge of what light can do in a photograph, you can make a wonderful photograph. So I make photographs. And I constructed this book. So it's more of a construction rather than a written thing. So I'm going to read some pieces. First, I'll read a little bit of my intro to give you an idea of what the purpose of the book was, other than publishing my photographs. Oliver Stone made a movie called The Doors, which is a travesty because I was there in the 60s. I was there in Los Angeles where the film supposedly takes place. I didn't recognize anything. I recognized the music in the film, but I didn't recognize me in the film, or my friends in the film, or even the band, The Doors. And I especially didn't recognize Jim. And so I write in the intro. In these pages, Jim is candidly revealed by the people who knew him, who were his pals, colleagues, mentors, and lovers. You'll find funny stories, secrets revealed, and truths more startling than any of the distortion spread during his life. Jim Morrison, Friends Gather Together, focuses on issues and occasions that illuminate an extraordinary man and gifted creative artist. What we are searching for in these clues and glimpses is a more detailed rendering, a more humane and accurate portrait. By weighing the observations of those who knew Jim, you can reach your own conclusions about who he was and what his life meant. The pieces are provided. It's up to you to make the picture whole. So because I'm reading from two different books, a book of Jim's poems, and this book, I decided rather than make a mistake about what page I'm on, I put everything together on some pieces of paper here. So the first person that I want to talk about is a guy by the name of Bill Simmons. He was the Doors manager and a friend of Jim's, a friend of mine. He was their roadie when he was 19 and became their manager at the age of 19. So I asked Bill, what do you remember about seeing Jim in the Doors for the first time? And Bill says, what I remember is Jim on stage. I wasn't affected one way or the other by meeting him off stage, but when I saw him on stage, I was more emotionally gripped and moved and disturbed than I had ever been at any similar type of thing. I ended up sitting in the audience at the show watching this maniac. I remember thinking, what? What is he saying? What is he doing? I don't get it. And then he said something about still sea conspires in armor. I went, this guy's completely out of his mind. But I was moved by it. I could feel it. It was the first time poetry had been a movie to me. And that's what I always thought of Jim's poetry. It was like a movie. The images were so strong that they came to mind in photo form instead of imagination. I could see the horses jumping off the boat. I could see them drowning. So what was my first impression of Jim? He scared me to death. And this is the poem that Bill is talking about. It's called Horse Latitudes. It's an area in the ocean in which, because of atmospheric pressure, the wind stops blowing. And during the 14th, 15th, and 16th century with sailing ships, they would sit in the ocean waiting for a breeze to come and fill the sails. And while they were waiting, the livestock that they brought on board, mostly horses, because these were people who were taking horses to the New World, would be dying of thirst. And also they were weighty, so they would slow down the progress of the ship. So this is the way the poem goes. When the still sea conspires in armor, and her sullen and aborted currents breed tiny monsters, true sailing is dead. Awkward instant, and the first animal is jettisoned. Legs furiously pumping their stiff green gallop, and heads bob up, poise, delicate, pause, consent, in mute nostril agony, carefully refined and sealed over. The next person who I interviewed was a guy named Ron Allen, who's a musician still to this day. He was a musician in the 60s and played all the Sunset Strip clubs. So I asked Ron, what's the background of the graveyard poem? I heard you were there. Ron says, that took place at night that we played a club called the Sea Witch, which was on Sunset Strip right across from Ben Frank's, a little east of that. Jim had come down and we had been hanging out for about 3 days and were very wasted by the time the gig started. I was playing for about a half hour into the set and I passed out on stage. Fell off the organ and passed out. Rick, the singer, came over and started playing keyboards and Jim got up and started singing. I was out for about an hour, I guess. And then, after the gig, we went to a couple of girls' houses that we knew, Pam and Peggy. A couple of girls that hung out with the band. So we went over to their place, and we all took some acid, and we saw the graveyard across the street, right there on Gower, just south of Santa Monica Boulevard. And it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, and we were looking at that graveyard, and we figured, that'd be a good place to go right now. So me and Rick and Jim and these 2 girls, Pam and Peggy, climbed the walls and went into the graveyard. The minute we got into the graveyard, we saw a white rabbit, and we chased the white rabbit, and it got away. And we just stayed there and walked around. It was like almost defying death in a way. Defying death to embrace it. There's death, why hide from it? So, Ron, who initiated the visit to the graveyard? Ron says, I don't remember. As always in those experiences with Jim, we were pretty much as crazy as he was as far as taking chances and doing outrageous things. We went over as a group, and as I remember, standing looking at the graveyard and thinking, that's where we should be, in there. We probably just moved towards it, got drawn right into it. It was a great night, and Jim starts the poem, it was the greatest night of my life. And we did really have a good time. We went back in there a number of times after that, late at night, sitting around, wondering what to do. Well, what should we do? Well, let's go to the graveyard. And we go back in there and move around some more. That had to be 68, maybe early 68. So this is the poem. It was the greatest night of my life. Although I still had not found a wife, I had my friends right there beside me. We were close together. Indians scattered on dawn's highway bleeding, ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind. We scaled the wall, we tripped through the graveyard, ancient shapes were all around us. No music, but the wet grass felt fresh beside the fog. 2 made love in a silent spot, one chased a rabbit into the dark. A girl got drunk and mauled the dead, and I gave empty sermons to my head. Cemetery, cool and quiet, hate to leave your sacred lay. Dread the milky coming of the day. I'd love to stay. I'd love to stay. I'd love to stay. So then there's another friend of Jim's. Her name is Ginny Ganahl. She was for a time the office secretary at the Doer's office. And, well, I'll just read it. So my question to her was, what about Jim's poem, Ode to L.A., while thinking of Brian Jones, deceased? She says, yeah, that was 69, July 3rd of 69. What I was wondering, Ginny, was how did Jim come to get that poem printed and distributed at a concert? Were you involved with that? Ginny says, yeah. I remember the day Brian Jones died. You know, with England being 8 hours ahead of LA, I remember that I heard about it on the radio on the way to work that morning. We wouldn't have been working on the 4th of July, so I think it was probably the day of the 3rd, hearing it on the radio going to work. And it had an impact on me. I've certainly been a fan of the Stones. They were never like, I mean, I liked the Beatles better, but I loved Brian Jones. And we didn't think any of us were mortal. And so I remember on the way to work really being impacted by that, really feeling like, God, somebody drowned, how awful. You know, I've been in the business a little bit before that with the Teen Set magazine. And I'd also worked for the Buffalo Springfield. And you know, I'd been around a while, so I did feel like it kind of touched me, personally. Anyway, Jim called that morning and said that he'd written a poem. He said, "You want to hear it?" And I said, "Of course." So we read it, and I was mesmerized. I asked, "This is the same morning that Brian Jones died?" Ginny says, "Yeah. I mean, he might have called at 11 or 12. He might have called at noon or even 1. And he said he'd written a poem. I don't think I was aggressive enough to say, 'Gee, would you read it to me?' As I recall, he said, 'Do you want to hear it?' So that was really near my time with the Doors, the end of my time with the Doors. And I had heard a lot of and read a lot of Jim's poetry and lyrics, but I was very moved by the poem. I thought it was brilliant. And the end of it, that smile, that porky satyr's leer has leaped upward into the loam, was just so Jim Morrison to me, and yet it was Brian Jones too. I felt he really captured something. Anyway, I think I probably did encourage him to get it printed, because that Aquarius date, that concert at the Aquarius was coming up. And it was close enough so that he could print it and pass it out as a tribute to Brian. So here's the poem. It's called Ode to L.A. while thinking of Brian Jones, deceased. I'm a resident of the city. They've just picked me to play the Prince of Denmark. Poor Ophelia. All those ghosts he never saw floating to doom on an iron candle. Come back, brave warrior. Do the dive on another channel. Hot-butted pool. Where's Marrakesh? Under the falls, the wild storm where savages fell out in late afternoon. Monsters of rhythm, you've left your nothing to compete with silence. I hope you went out smiling like a child into the cool remnant of a dream. The angel man, with serpents competing for his palms and fingers, finally claimed this benevolent soul. Ophelia, leaves sodden in silk, chlorine dream, mad stifled witness, the diving board, the plunge, the pool. You are a fighter, a damask musky muse. You were the bleached sun for TV afternoon. Horned toads, maverick of a yellow spot. Look now where it's got you. In meat heaven with the cannibals. The gardener found the body, rampant, floating, lucky stiff. What is this green pale stuff you're made of? Poke holes in the goddess' skin. Will he stink, carried heavenward through the halls of music? No chance. Requiem for a heavy. That smile, that porky satyr's leer has leaped upward into the loam. So as an editor's note, as I said, this poem was written probably the day that Brian Jones died. And Brian Jones was a founding member of the Rolling Stones. His bandmates kicked him out for probably economic reasons. And Brian Jones drowned under mysterious circumstances in a swimming pool at his home in England on July 3rd, 1969. Jim Morrison died 2 years later on July 3rd, 1971, in water and under mysterious circumstances. Both men were 27 years old. So the last piece I want to read was a little, doesn't do justice to the interview, but I thought the poem was necessary. This is a guy by the name of Babe Hill, who was one of Jim's closest friends. He worked on 2 of the films that Jim and I and he and another guy made together. And he spent a lot of time with Jim. So I say, in lots of poems and songs, Jim uses the same 2 lines, babe. The lines are, the hitchhiker stood by the side of the road and leveled his thumb in the cool, calm calculus of reason. Babe says, that's the whole thing of life. I don't know, man, that's just too beautiful to define. You define it within yourself, but to describe it, you can't do it. Jim saw himself as the ultimate hitchhiker, with no future and no past, and no present, no hope of any of those things. The ultimate existential moment. And the poem goes like this. Tell them you came and saw and looked into my eyes and watched the shadows of the guard receding. Thoughts in time and out of season, the hitchhiker stood by the side of the road and leveled his thumb in the cool, calm calculus of reason. Thank you.
things. We have some food, and I wanna make sure that people actually get a chance to eat, and I want those questions to be answered too.
Okay.
But I wanna let everybody know, so let's do the questions, but I wanna get people to go grab some food.
Well,
Questions?
I'd like to ask Steve a question to start off. How many of those phrases that you have in that book did you collect over a period of time? Those colloquial Americanisms?
I didn't count them, but I'll bet you there's 30 or 40. So at one point, he's talking about a ranch hand, and he says, that boy needed instructions with gloves. In fact, the title, All Hat, I heard that, oh my gosh, 45 years ago. A fellow was talking about another guy, and that he wasn't sincere, that he was a pretender. And he said, he's all hat and no cattle. And that's really what that's from.
No.
Yeah.
No cat.
Cattle.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah. So I don't know how many. Whenever I get a chance.
Writers often collect phrases that they hear, current phrases that they can put into books, and many writers make index cards
Yeah.
of those phrases.
I did.
And people who write detective novels, I think, do that very often. Do you do that, John?
No, I don't. Partly because I write book, I'm just seeing what's above my computer, so it's unusual for me to put something in it. But I do, I tell you, I write on my business cards in malls when Joni and a friend are shopping. And I can get a chapter outlined.
Business card.
A business card, and those I use. I come home and I type it up immediately.
That's a segue to my question. Your medium is photography, so it may or may not apply to you. But what is your chosen instrument? Longhand, typewriter, computer word processor?
If I had to write longhand, I wouldn't write. It's just hard. So computer for me.
I think some people think that's part of the process.
Steinbeck wrote with a pencil.
Yeah.
When I first started, I wrote on a yellow pad with my favorite ballpoint. And that lasted until I had to revise the first time.
Yeah.
And then I was cutting, slices and pieces and pasting it together like I used to write
Really
for
good
papers.
stuff.
So I had to relearn how to type. But now I think looking above or I don't think, but I looking above the computer, so that luckily the hands operate without.
I think you told me the story about the character who went the wrong way. And I was lucky enough to be really mentored by Elizabeth George, who's a well-known writer. And I think all writers have some variation on the spectrum of rigidly plotting to, and they call it pantser, by the seat of your pants. And people, are somewhere in the middle. Well, Elizabeth is plots to a certain extent. She taught me a process, or she talked about the process that she uses. But it is fairly disciplined. I think that's the thing. And she's a mystery writer. And she said one time she got to the end of a book thinking that a certain character was the murderer. And within pages of the end said, that's not right, he can't do it, and had to come up now with a new culprit. So I think it's, and I want to say this too, you talked about people entering your space. When writing is best for me, it really is like a daydream. It's like you're watching this thing unfold, and you're just writing down what you're seeing, rather than making it up.
Frank, you said something I'm not a writer. I'm a documentarian. But you, with your questions that you ask in your book, you are creating the foundation for as a storyteller. I mean, you're hearing what people are telling you, but you're the one who's asking those questions. And I think you guys, when you're going through and doing your stories, you're asking questions. Does that make sense? It's almost like that you're all storytellers. You're in a category of telling a story that is what we need to keep, we need to protect. You know, it's something that I think people are not losing, but we need to continue to protect it. And it's important, and it's just as much, I think, I mean, here's the question. Do you consider yourself a storyteller?
Absolutely, and
Okay.
I made a couple of dozen documentary films, and each one of them, I tried to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end, mystery hanging over the story, giving information, but also entertaining people with the documentary. So storytelling is essential, whether you're sitting around a campfire 2 million years ago with a bunch of other guys and telling a story, or we're here telling stories tonight. Storytelling, I think, is the key.
And in documentary writing, there has to be tension, and there has to be a evolving understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I didn't buy your not being a writer.
I wonder if there are experiences like they're sort of getting at, that somewhere along the line you're shooting and you have all this raw material, and the story turns out to be something different than you thought the story you were telling.
I had an experience where I was making a film for the federal government about drinking and driving, and so I decided, after working on it for a while and shooting it, and I gave the film to an editor, which I don't usually do, and I came back from a vacation and he had made a different film out of my footage. And so I fired him. And I took over the film. But it's that absolute focus on the story you're telling from the beginning that has to carry through, I think. I don't know how these guys do it, but for a film, I start off with a premise, and if that premise is provable, and I can have an anecdotal as well as scientific evidence to make that come out in the end, then I'll follow that path. If not, then sometimes I have to give up the film because it's just not working.
Charlie, you mentioned how it was life-changing for getting in a writer's group, and what that did for you. And one of the things that a writer's group does, I think, is you read some of the characters. You have readers who aren't related, and they respond, and then you change based on feedback and that kind of stuff. The value of the writers group, I know Steve and Dave, and I know a lot of people are in writers groups, and they really are beneficial in terms of taking, I don't know whether documentary, whether you actually show the thing to a group that then go back and change it based on the feedback or not, but I know with writers, they certainly do, or they should anyway. Do you find it that the Easy Writers Group has helped you with those books?
I think they're terrific, yeah. I would say, if you get into a writers group, there's a couple of things. Get into a good writers group, which, how do you know? But I was briefly in a group where they met to drink wine, and that's not particularly helpful. And I think it may have been that one, or it may have been part of another one, where the people didn't really want to get better. They wanted to bring their work and have us tell them how good they were. And that's not helpful. So the last thing with a writers group that I would say is, you have to, as you evolve as a writer, and I think gain strength in your vision, strong enough to withstand some of the criticism. Because if you're in with 6 people, often you'll get 6 opinions. And take what's good, take what works for you, and politely reject the rest. And I have to say, I was in
with Elizabeth. One of the people in there is Patty Smiley, who's gone on to be a successful writer. She's got 5 or 6 novels out. And she would get a criticism, and she would say, "That's a good idea. It's not for this book, but it's a good idea." And so you have to be strong enough in your vision to resist that, because you can't just keep changing things.
With documentary films, they're usually sponsored, so I would have to show a rough cut to the sponsors. And a lot of times I made films that had to do with social issues, and so there were bureaucrats who would come and view the film and then tell me how I should change the film so that it fit their point of view. And I would say, yes, that's a great idea, wonderful, and I'd go ahead and make the film I was making. And then they take credit for the film I made.
They're so smart.
Just a liar.
Once you are successfully published by a publishing house, how much influence are they putting on you to formulate your success and do the same thing again? I find so many new novels now are formulaic.
Sure. You maybe could address that best.
I can tell you my experience, and that is that I believe with a good agent or a good house, they don't dictate in any way what you choose to write. What dictates it in the last, I'm going to say 5 years, is the marketing committee. And your editor, used to be your editor could say, "We're doing this book." And if you were like at McMinnville would do the book. But in the last 5 years, it's the marketing committee. And so your editor has to believe in the book, and then he takes your book to the marketing committee. And the marketing committee makes decisions like this. Is this a sellable sector of the population? Will it offend any people? How will it do in the cities? Will it be bought by the schools? Will it go as far as, anyway, they ask all these questions. And it's not, even though there are a plethora of books, if you go to, if you're a writer and you go into Powell's bookstore, you want to kill yourself on the spot because there are like 200,000 books and they're just coming out on conveyor belts. It doesn't seem like that's possible, but there are a lot fewer books being made than there used to be because of that bottleneck at the top.
I'm curious, and this goes to all 3 of you in different ways, but as you were talking about what's saleable and who might be offended, there's such an issue in terms of political correctness these days, and I'm a strong Democrat, but at the same, and within that though, I'm a big defender of the ACLU. And I'm assuming that when you write, and whether it's you're writing about someone or you're engaging in a topic, or you've got characters, they're not always going to fit what's politically correct in that given moment in time. And how do you deal with that?
I submitted an essay to Paper Gardens this year, and I was really pleased that it was selected. And I was pleased that the judge was Tracy Doherty, who is, he's an educator and he's a prolific author and so on. And just honestly, for him to like it and accept it was a big deal to me. And then right before the chapbook was printed, I got an email that they wanted me to change it because, and again, this is not fiction, this was an essay. It was about an encounter I had with a fellow who happened to be Hispanic. And they were afraid that it would come across as prejudicial or racist and offered suggestions to change it. So that's the story. So anyway, I withdrew it, but that's an occasion when political correctness, and I think it's run amok. I think if you really read the thing, it was a guy who happened to be Hispanic. It's not that I
Just
don't
you
like
think
Hispanics.
someone was being overly concerned.
Yeah. So I suppose that if
to be commercially viable, is a consideration. I
But
don't-
can all writers afford to cling to their own felt? Or do they
I
have
don't know.
to? I think it's horrible if they have to give in to it.
You know, you asked earlier about, and I think you were talking about, you put out a book and it's successful and you go, hey, I know what, I'll do the same thing again, you know, as to capitalize on that. And you don't wanna do that on the one hand. On the other hand, genre fiction, that's what it is. And so, Robert Parker, as an example, I had a teacher who said he's been writing past his sell-by date. But, you know, I mean, he doesn't care what we think because he's selling a lot of books.
He's selling them from the grave.
He does what?
He's selling them from the grave.
Yeah, some of those, who was it, VC?
Yeah.
She wrote more after she was dead.
One of my friends that I had to school with that I think I talked about earlier was 2 years ago the most banned author in America.
Oh, really?
He earned that distinction by having young people and parents say the F word in conversations, or even report the F word. He didn't earn it for talking about lesbian gay relationships or incest or all of the topics, all the domestic violence that he and I both talk about in our books. That was not an issue. It was the F word. And
That's amazing. That's amazing.
anyway, in context, it makes perfect sense. I was a 5-year-old girl reporting a conversation where she says the N word, reporting a conversation she's heard at home, and that book was fought vigorously throughout the nation. So there's that kind of censorship. On the other hand, I don't think there's anything you can't say or portray in a book that I'm aware of, except that maybe the committee will say, well, that's too inflammatory, although 50 Shades of Grey probably blew the lid off that.
Yeah.
Are there any issues with anything like that, Frank?
Well, my book is full of F-bombs and
I know.
bombs, but I self-published it, and I didn't have to convince myself that I just transcribed
It's
the
historically
conversations
correct.
and interviews, and so it was easy. And I knew before I made the decision to self-publish it that if I went to a publisher, the book would be delayed 1.5 years while they checked every fact and wanted to argue with me about every phrase that these people were using. So I published the book in 3 or 4 months. The interviews were done, they were transcribed, put it together, learn how to use InDesign or one of those programs, and you got a book. But it's sitting in a storage unit, boxes of it. No one told me about that part.
Yeah.
You did, that was originally Time Warner, wasn't it? Didn't they commission that?
Time Warner commissioned a book, Warner Books commissioned a book for me of photographs,
Oh, okay.
but they wanted text. So I went out and interviewed people. And so I used little pieces of the text in that book, but then I had these long interviews. And one day I found the tapes I had made, and I thought, gee, these are great. I read the transcripts, and I thought, well, I'll just put all of these interviews out myself. I owned the rights to them, so it was quite simple. I forgot
You had
about
a machine to play the tape on.
Yeah, I even had a machine to play the tape.
And then,
Well, I have it's not really a question so much as it's sort of like a plea to maybe have a follow-up. First of all, I'm gonna say I'm a social worker, I work in a locked psychiatric facility, so I'm kind of drawn to the dark side. But, I'm
Yes,
looking
I know
forward,
what you mean.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. But pivoting to Steve, Troby Dark. Dark as a last name. And then also, other than she was like this teenage vixen that he had this sexual obsession with, I want to know more about Shelby Dark. I felt she was a little two-dimensional. And when he went and did sort of the stalker thing, and she came out in her puffy coat and her 2 kids, and then waved the beat, and then the husband came out and he went, okay, you're not going there. I wanted to know more about her. And I thought the mother was so explained that you could understand these 2 sons and the husband and the controlling and all that stuff. But I also felt like the second wife, I mean, she was like this little sort of Catholic goddess, and she was the great mom and the great wife, and she was wonderful. But I don't think there would have been any resolution between the 2 brothers without her and without those kids. And so I
Trilby's kids?
no,
Oh, her, okay.
his niece and nephew.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to know more about those 2 characters because they're the reason for the story. But I don't know. I felt kind of left high and dry with Trilby.
Trilby is the least deep character,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just right about that. So Owen's mother has a backstory,
Mm-hmm.
which you get. Iris kind of has a backstory,
Mm-hmm.
but Trilby, it's I could almost use the word MacGuffin.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's she's just there for that one thing.
Yeah, she
And-
just
and
seems
you're
so
right.
sad and abused, and
Yeah.
you know, a few little clips while she's taking her clothes off. I'm just like,
Did that happen?
I
remember-
she's sorry.
I remember.
Well, it kind of is, and I remember you and I talking, and I was just so excited when it finished, and I loved it. And you said, yeah, you know, I felt really good that it wasn't all tied up neat with a little bow. That
Right.
there was just this strong, to quote you, there was just this strong maybe.
Yeah.
And I was so pleased that you ended it that way. So I'm hoping that maybe there's a little bit more to come.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I think that those characters have more to say.
Kathy likes. So Owen came from the first book,
Mm-hmm.
and lots of people like Mrs. Garcia,
Mm-hmm.
who is a minor character in the first book, and so something may happen with her.
Mm-hmm.
But not
Well,
Trilby.
and the cute older couple, you know, when he takes her in the snowstorm to the Waffle House or whatever, I mean, it was just, I was just, you know, I always think of that when I drive by like Sherry's, because I work crazy hours, and I do crisis work, so I get called out on pagers and stuff, and I always think of that when I'm driving by Sherry's at, you know, 11 o'clock at night, and there's people there eating and lots of conversation, and
Yeah.
I'm just like, it's just cute. They
I'd
were
like to
really
go
fun.
back to Mike's question for a minute about or thought about the writing groups, because I'm imagining that often people in the audience want to write, and I can only imagine how insurmountable that sometimes seems, and how much good and bad advice there is out there. Write What You Know, for example, is completely enigmatic. You have to have another chapter, another 10 pages to understand what anyone might actually mean by that. But with a writing group, you get a chance to understand how your words are being communicated. And what a writer, I believe, really hopes for is that the scene or the emotion I'm attempting to get a hold of here is something you will sense and feel and even be grabbed by. At our very best, maybe you'll even be touched by it. And I don't know how we learn that. We all have our blind spots. And so we can't always imagine what other people are thinking or hearing.
Right.
I have so many examples of that from the writing groups. But it's really critical to have a group with people you respect. If you're going to do a writing group, you need to know the other people's writing enough so that you can decide how to weigh their opinion, like Dave was talking. I know several new writers who have gone to writers' conferences and been damaged by a jackass off-the-wall opinion, somebody who had no business opening their mouth. So if you're not going to get at least encouragement, hopefully you find people whose perception you admire, so that you can use something about what they have to tell you. And I learned that in all these writers groups over the years. And I still look for them.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
You first.
I was just gonna say, that really is great advice across the board whenever you're trying to learn something, no matter what it is, because there's a lot of fakers out there in the world
There
who
you
would
go.
much prefer to put you down than build you up when you're trying to learn something new. And looking for someone from a mentor perspective. I mean, I know just even opening a gallery, right? People would either wanna see me succeed or see me fail, right? And that mentorship, finding people who can mentor you from different aspects, right? Isn't that kind of what you're saying from a group? That you should expect from a group?
Well, I see it as a group of peers.
Peers.
I want to write with people whose writing I admire and who can tell me the truth, their truth, and who can accept my opinion. And I want to hear their opinion. I've learned an enormous amount. But it's not an unequal relationship like a mentor-student.
It's a give or take.
Yes.
It's a give and take. I
Yeah.
should say, not give or, it's a give and. Got it?
Or take.
Take.
David?
My first writers group was a group in Portland, and I just kind of stumbled over them. I answered an ad on the internet and went to a retreat that they had on the coast, just kind of sight unseen. But I was fortunate. I stumbled into a group that a beginning writer really needs to have this. If you're going to start showing your work, please find somebody that's going to really like your work a lot, because as you say, there's idiots out there that'll just say, oh, this is no good. And if you're really vulnerable and brand new, you're going to put your head in the shell and never write again. And I was fortunate to find a group that really encouraged me and really liked my work. And what happened after that was I said, okay, I know enough of how to write for this group of people that really like my work. And then I plunged into another writers group that was really totally brutal. And that's exactly what I needed at that particular time. It was going to give me the flat, honest truth about what I was doing. And what came out of that was a greater sense of how I was communicating, exactly what you were saying. How I was communicating my ideas to a fresh off the boat reader that didn't know me and didn't know my words at all. How that was coming across, which makes me a better writer.
What do you think about prompts?
I love them.
Prompts?
Prompts are ideas, pictures, objects, words that give a writer a prompt, a story or a poem or
I think if you're working on, if you have a project, like I'm working on a book, I think prompts take the time that I should be working on the book. So if you're not doing that, I think you're fine. You guys, we did in class, what, a couple of years ago or last year? Tin House?
Yeah.
It was it every week? I think you had to write, was it 500 words?
I think it was for like 5 weeks or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the prompts was, the author has a conversation with one of his characters. And that was a lot of fun, because the characters kind of go their own way and, whose story is this?
That was with Tin House?
That was Tin House, yeah.
Which are.
I think it depends on where you're at the moment. If you wanna write and you're not really writing anything, I think prompts are great. If you're working on something, work on it.
I have an opinion that's worth absolutely nothing. But I think there's a great deal of fear in myself and other people about the blank page, about opening a new sheet on the computer or sitting there with a tablet. And a prompt reduces that anxiety. And so while I think they're fun, I don't believe they advance what I'm hoping for in writing, which is the ability to somehow say my story, whatever that is.
But you're dealing with a long form. You know, I'm involved in something called Poetry While You Wait, right? Which is, somebody comes in here, they're gonna get some wine, and they say, I'd like a poem about conversation with the writer. I'm gonna go have some wine. So I, blank page, write, they get about an hour, and I hand them a poem. And they want it read, okay? And you look into their eyes when you're reading the poem that they ordered, that they just asked for, that they just prompted. And we do that every month downtown here. And there's about 5 of us, and yeah, there is some existential terror.
I think that's a startlingly challenging inspiration exercise, and I admire it enormously. I don't think it's a prompt. I think someone is laying something out and you have to let go of your thinking and write. And that, I think, calls everything from you. But if I say to a group, today we're going to talk about my first experience with a horse, I don't think that creates the same response in people. So that's all I meant.
Yeah. Well, and the long form as opposed to the short form, like what Jim Morrison did on the day that the fellow died. You know, that was the same day. He was responding to an incident. He was letting go and saying what he felt at that moment about that thing. But it's a short form. You know, it's not a novel.
Mike, you know, when you first asked your question, I thought of something else, and that is, if you're working in a long form, I've heard people say that they'll use an object to center them. So maybe, I'm making this up, maybe it's a stone that you plucked from the river that you're writing about, and you have that on your desk and it helps you think about it. But I also want to say, for what I write, it's character driven more than plot driven. And what really helps me is voice. So if I can read something either in the voice, if somebody else has written it and I want that voice, or if I've written something previously that I really like and really reflects that voice, it's like a rhythm. To hear the way they talk, to hear the way it goes, that helps me more than something else.
Where do you write these poems?
We set up next to Nick's it's Ransom's tasting room, 3rd on 3rd, which is the 3rd Friday of each month at the Arc of Wine Hop. And next to its Daughter's Deli and Ransom's, right next to Nick's Cafe.
Cool.
And Ransom actually
know
posts
about
them
that.
on their Facebook page a lot when they're out there. I was actually very curious that I think it's very cool to see.
Yeah, it's fun.
You should eat something.
I say I'm not a writer, but I'm a
Thank you
consumer,
for
and I
coming.
just thank all of you.
Thank you.
While the guys were talking and reading, I had a system breakdown in my entire inventory system, but it's all back up for these guys. So we have books for sale, and the guys will be available at the table if you guys want them to sign.
Not me, I'm gonna be eating.
You can take the food to the table too. But you're gonna put your chairs in.
That's great. Poetry on demand.
You know, there's always
I really love writing. Larry started writing.
will they show up? They'll hear your voice.
Story I'm working on now, that came from the first 4 words. Hi, Kathy.